Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and I'm here for my MSI bracket stage day 6 overview and analysis. Again, very excited to get into the two series that we're going to cover today. It's going to be the same format as we had yesterday in that video, where we're going to be covering, obviously, one series from winners round number 2, or upper bracket round number 2, and then another series from lower bracket round number 1. Yesterday, we saw our first team get eliminated from MSI bracket stage. Today, we will see our second team. Which team from NA is going to go out, and which team from the LPL is going to be moving on to face T1 in upper bracket finals. A lot of really fun questions. I want to know what you guys think. Let me know down in the comment section below. Who did you think was going to be winning these series? Did you have any upsets? I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback, of course. Also, let me know what you guys think of the tournament and the content as a whole. Of course, if you're new to the channel, we've been covering every single day of MSI action. Not only that, but we previewed every bit of it before the tournament as well. If you want to check any of that out, you can go ahead and check that out up in the iCard right now. Up there is going to be my bracket stage preview, my MSI primer from before the event, if you want an in-depth breakdown of how these teams like to play. And then also, of course, you know, a playlist that's going to cover every single day from MSI play-ins included. You can check that all out if you want to get a little bit more info on what I think of some of these teams. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. What we do here on this channel is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate in each game. Of course, we'll be giving out a player of the game, a dud of the game, and at the end of every series, we're going to give out a dud of the series as well. So a lot of fun stuff coming here, but we're going to be kicking it off just like yesterday with a matchup in upper bracket round 2. We're going to be seeing two teams that faced off against each other in the LPL finals go head-to-head, as we have the number 1 seed from the LPL in JD Gaming taking on the number 2 seed from the LPL in Bilibili Gaming. Always an intriguing matchup to see LPL teams go head-to-head because their styles are very fun to see clash. Now, neither of these teams really plays like the prototypical LPL style of just like blitzing you early in the game. I think BLG definitely, you know, was on the precipice of that, but the, the play style of Invictus Gaming from the past isn't necessarily alive and well. And these two teams in particular, JD Gaming, I would consider to be one of the more disciplined teams at this entire tournament. That's not to say that they can't absolutely demolish the early game. I talked about this a bit in the preview, but they have more wins in under 22 minutes than any team in any major region in the world. They absolutely obliterate teams early on in games, and that absolutely shows when you go and, you know, watch some of their tape, especially against teams that they know they can beat. But BLG, you know, they really tested them in the finals. This was a team that I think matchup-wise actually matches up pretty interestingly. The top lane matchup in particular is something that a lot of LPL fans like to bring up. A lot of LPL fans love Bin on BLG, and, you know, 369 hasn't exactly been in the same form that he was in 2022. Same with the fact that, you know, emerging stars like Elkanon are playing really well in the bot lane for BLG, but they're going into Ruler and Missing, who might just be the single best bot lane in the entire world. So my prediction was exactly what happened in the LPL finals. I had predicted JDG in 4, and I don't think I'm really going to change that at all for my pre-bracket predictions. I think a lot of that has stayed put. I think BLG, you know, might be able to win a game here or there, but JDG just should be the better team. BLG is crazy enough to be able to throw stuff at them, but they should be able to come through. But, of course, let me know what you think down in the comment section below, and it's time to jump into the action. Of course, going game by game, we got to start with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was JD Gaming. They are able to take the first game in this series. They were able to kick us off with a win, and momentum-wise, that's going to be big for them. It's not nearly as important for them as I would say it is for some other teams. They're actually pretty momentum-proof, as we've kind of seen over the course of the split. It's a big reason why I like this team a lot. It's because they kind of just play well whenever they decide to play well. They don't need to necessarily be in good form, like a lot of the other teams, including BLG at this tournament, do, but putting BLG on the back foot is always going to be a positive in a best-of-5 series like this. They played really well. This was pretty dominant, not really a lot of advantages going over to BLG, not because they played particularly awful, not a lot of crazy mechanical mistakes, but more so because JDG got control early and then just never gave it up. So how exactly did we get there? Well, like I said, JDG was really aggressive in the early game. They were looking to make a lot of plays, most of them, at least in the beginning of the game, centered around bot lane, which I do agree with. You've got Ruler on this Aphelios, you've got Missing on this Thresh, that's a really aggressive lane, and then obviously you've got the Kha'Zix. You want to be able to generate that map control, that objective control early on in games so that you can kind of allow this Kha'Zix to move around, especially going into a matchup like Nidalee where she's often going to have prio in the early game. If you can kind of flip those roles, Kha'Zix is just going to be a big menace for that Nidalee basically for the rest of the time that she's supposed to be strong, and so I really like this idea of going bot lane, and it does work for the most part. They end up 4-manning for First Blood. Under tower, they end up diving Elk, poor Elk, but he does trade one back. It's a really good exchange. I'm not really sure how JDG ended up messing that up, but at the very least, they were able to gain the First Blood, and then another gank bot to be able to pick him up a little bit later. It's just a lot of aggression thrown at a player that isn't necessarily known for sitting under tower and just kind of playing passively. Elk and On are a very aggressive bot lane duo, one of the more aggressive ones in the entire world, and I definitely understand the idea behind wanting to kind of target them early game, especially if you feel like you can get that Kha'Zix on top of them, and I thought they did a relatively good job of that. They ended up transitioning a lot of that pressure up into Heralds, not only the first Herald, but the second Herald, and both of these fights were very similar, so I'm kind of going to clump them together. Both of them were good fights for BLG, or at least they looked like good fights for BLG, until Ruler just absolutely started obliterating their entire front line, and that was really kind of the overarching theme of a lot of this game, is Ruler really absolutely demolishing BLG in a lot of these team fights. There really wasn't a lot of options for BLG to be able to answer because the dive on the backline really is just not going to be efficient. It's really just Lissandra, and that's only if she can actually get in. And you don't really want Lissandra just diving the AD carry perma 24/7. That's not really a great strategy for her as a champion, and even then, you know, so long as you have good peel coming out on the side of JDG, you do have ways of countering that. And so overall, you know, once Ruler got ahead, it was a little bit of a not close game, I should say. A much easier game for JDG to win, in my opinion, and that's kind of what they had. That's not to say anybody else wasn't playing well. Everybody on the team was playing well, but this was definitely a Ruler-focused game in terms of carry potential. A couple of big fights in the mid-game. The big one, obviously, that I talked about was second Herald, but a big extended dragon fight at third dragon that JDG really were just better in. This was a really slow, really drawn-out experience for both teams, neither really wanting to give things over. Knight was consistently playing on the edge of danger on this flank position, trying to keep Yagao out of the fight, and he honestly did a fantastic job at that. But eventually, Jun ends up going down inside the pit. He goes a little bit too far. Kanavi's able to secure the dragon, and BLG have to run. It only is a 1-for-0 and dragon, but the fight is really big for JDG to basically just say, like, you're not going to be able to get soul. That's not going to be a win condition for you. We're never going to let you get to that point in the game with that third dragon take. And then eventually, JDG win a big fight in the mid lane. They're able to transition that into taking Baron, and then Baron all the way down to mid lane so that they can end. It's a pretty simple, cut and dry game, if we're being entirely honest. JDG just played really well. They were by far the better team in this game, and the 24-minute win is definitely an example of that. It definitely is appropriate that this game ended as quickly as it did. Player of the game for me is going to go to Ruler. I know that there are a couple of options on this team that I think you could realistically give this to, because I do think that a lot of the players on JDG actually did play well in this game. I'm going to give it to Ruler because he was the one that the team invested in, that the team said, we're going to let you carry us, and honestly, his position and gun management and just, you know, his aggressiveness in team fights was basically perfect. There's a reason I call him the best AD carry in the world. And I think he really showed that off in this series, or in this game, I should say. He was fantastic. Missing was phenomenal on this Thresh. The dude was perfect for peel. He wasn't making any of these, like, ridiculous flash hook, like, highlight reel plays, but that's not what this team needed him to do in this game. They needed him to be a little bit more stable, for him to be able to keep that Aphelios alive, and for him to be able to make sure that the other team didn't have a lot of opportunities to be able to get on his backline. And I thought he did a fantastic job of that. One of the better Missing games in quite a while, in my opinion. And then Knight in the mid lane was also spectacular, just consistently playing on the edge of danger and never getting himself actually caught. This is what a masterful Ahri performance looks like. It's just the mentality, it's the positioning, it's everything. He was just really good in this game. As for BLG on the other side, it was kind of hard to give out a dud of the game for game number one, because I don't really think that any particular player played bad. You can see the bad scoreline for Elk, but he was really targeted in the early game. Maybe he should have played a little bit safer, but as we saw, like, JDG was not afraid of 4-man diving bot lane, and I don't think that strategy would have gone away had Elkanon just sat under tower, and so I'm not going to blame them entirely. I don't think Jun had a particularly bad game, even if his objective control in the mid to late game wasn't particularly good. And then Bin on the Scion, you don't really want to see it, and he doesn't play it particularly well, but, you know, it ended up happening. I gave it to Yagao. I do want to make this small statement about Yagao. He gets a lot of hate, I think, from the community. He gets a lot of negative, I guess, press, I would say, from the community as a whole. Most of it, in my opinion, he absolutely doesn't deserve. Is he Yagao from 2022? No, but that was Yagao's best split of all time, and it's not even particularly close. He was a top 5 to 10 player in the world last year, and just because he's not that on BLG doesn't mean he's not an incredibly valuable player. In fact, honestly, he's only gotten better as the year has gone on. I know he hasn't been perfect at this MSI tournament, but I just see so many negative comments about him, and I don't think it's warranted. I really don't. I think he's been good enough, and I think that you could absolutely win a lot of games and be a top team in the world with the way Yagao is currently playing. He's not the kind of player that's going to push you over the edge anyways. He's a much more supportive style player, but, you know, when you have Bin on a tank, when you've got June not necessarily playing at a super high level, you put a lot of responsibility on that bot lane, and JDG kind of saw that and was able to take advantage of it in the early game, but BLG is going to have to bounce back relatively quickly. Of all the teams in the world, I think I would least want to go down 0-2 against JDG. There really aren't a lot of opportunities for you to win 3 games in a row against a team not only as talented as they are, but as coordinated and as clinical, I would say, in the mid to late game as they are. And so for BLG, you really got to kick yourself into high gear going into this game number 2, but for JDG, you could really take full control of this series if you just take this next one. So who's going to be able to take it? Is this series going to go 2-0, or is it going to tie up with the BLG win? Well, the winner of game number 2 was JD Gaming. They are able to take game number 2. They're able to go up into this series 2-0, and it certainly was not an easy ride to get there for this team. Honestly, them walking out with a win is pretty miraculous considering how the mid game went just in general for them throughout this one. They really invested a lot into this big front-to-back teamfight ID, and BLG was honestly just executing it better throughout a lot of the mid game, but they pulled through. They kept their head on straight. They were able to win the fight that mattered, and eventually, using a lot of their, I guess you would say, talent advantage in this game, they were able to come out on top. Really good stuff from them. This is exactly what you want to see from one of the best teams in the world. You want to see confidence in their ability to play through, you know, a particular lane and you know, have a lot of these players that maybe have been more well known as carries in the past be willing to take a little bit more of a back seat so that they can put themselves in the best position to win, and that's exactly what happened in this game. But how did we get there? What I'm talking about, BLG having this big lead. I'm talking about JDG coming back. How did all of that happen? Well, let's go ahead and talk about it. The early game, I will say, was relatively even from both teams. Both teams not necessarily wanting to make any massive waves. BLG do go for a little bit of a lane swap or a solo lane swap. They drafted the Fiora specifically to play into the Cassante, and so when they saw the Renekton R5, they just sent Yagao top lane on the Ahri instead to lane into it, trying to neutralize that early pressure that Renekton is able to offer. And honestly, for the most part, at least in BLG's case, it absolutely worked. Yagao was doing a good job into 369, and Bin was much more successful into Knight than Yagao would have been in the mid lane. It certainly was a better top lane matchup, so overall, I would definitely say that was a positive, but the negative for BLG was still going to be the bot lane. Honestly, Ruler and Missing are just really good on, ends up getting killed in a 2v2 for first blood down on the bot side, and that's not really ideal. BLG does get some more stuff back. Top lane, June with a nice gank onto 369 to be able to get Yagao a kill, and Yagao would definitely start paying that back as the game went further. It's good to see him having a really good game here in game number 2, but really where things start to kind of change out a lot, it's going to be the big second Drake fight, and this is where BLG really takes full control of the game, if we're being entirely honest. This was a masterful fight from the side of BLG. They played it basically as perfectly as they could have in this particular instance. On went in, and he was able to get a couple of knockups, and then June and Bin end up following, Yagao and Elk dealing damage on the backline. Really just good stuff overall from BLG, and this was a massive fight win. They were able to transition that into another really big win in the mid lane, this one where Yagao just absolutely goes nuts. An unbelievable team fight here from Yagao on the Ahri. This was one of the better team fights of the entire game from anybody. He played this about as masterfully as you could. Again, I know I'm a Yagao fan, but I'm gonna hype him up when he plays well, and he absolutely played well in this game number 2, even if things weren't able to get done. That fight leads them into getting Baron, but they're just not able to do all that much with it. They try to push in bot lane, but JDG do a really good job just disengaging them. BLG are consistently looking to try and engage at some point here, but JDG are spacing it perfectly, and they're really giving BLG no opportunity to continue to push a lot of the lead that they were able to generate. A couple of wet noodle fights down in the bot lane, a teleport from JDG to try and capitalize maybe on BLG staying a little bit too long without the Baron buff, but there really isn't a lot of plays to be made made there outside of getting the dragon. And so, yes, you know, JDG does end up coming out on top of it, but they aren't exactly able to completely shut down what BLG is able to create. Where JDG ends up getting back into the game is going to be in that second Baron fight, where some way, somehow, this comp actually finally gets to execute. The big beefy boys on JD Gaming, Renekton, Maokai, Cassante, Braum, give you so much pressure in a front-to-back team fight if you are able to get it, and as long as Ruler is able to pop off, they're going to be able to win, even behind in gold. And you know what? Ruler is a pretty damn good player, and we saw that in this game. He absolutely dominated that second Baron fight. He was able to win it basically on his own. They were able to get the Baron off of that as well, and then all it took was one final fight in the top lane where Ruler went absolutely nuts again on this Jinx, playing super aggro, just running through all the towers, auto-attacking, dealing a ridiculous amount of damage by the time we got here in this game. And JDG were able to end just like that. It just took the one fight at second Baron for JDG to basically say, hey, we know you had the lead the entire mid game with a couple of really good fights, but we're going to get a good fight of our own, and all of a sudden, all of that is going to turn. And that's the danger that this JD Gaming team offers you. They're so talented that even when they're on the back foot, it only takes one fight for them to be able to get back into it. BLG didn't even make any sort of major mistakes. They didn't fight that, you know, Baron fight perfectly at all. Elk gets caught out right at the beginning of it, which is about as disastrous as you could possibly get. He was the big damage dealer on the side of BLG, and he was just a little bit too far forward, but it was mostly JDG playing really aggro and putting themselves in a position where they were going to be able to capitalize on BLG making a mistake like that, and so it's just really scary to have to face a team like that, where it really feels like at no point in the game is your lead truly safe, and that was definitely shown off here. Player of the game, it's gotta go to Ruler. I know you gotta give a lot of credit to the people who set him up, but at the end of the day, he has to be the one to capitalize on a comp like this. This entire composition, this entire draft from JDG relies on Ruler being the best player on the Rift, and he rewarded them. He said, you know what? You need me to be the best player on the Rift? I can be the best player on the Rift, and he absolutely was in this game. Really, really fun stuff from the Jinx, and Ruler's been awesome across this entire tournament. He continues to be the best AD carry in the world, and I think he's really just proving it in every single game that he plays here. But everybody else was also good. Knight had a really good game on that Cassante. In that second Baron fight, that's really where things started to turn. He was fantastic in that fight, getting on top of Elk and really setting Ruler up, but 369, Kanavi missing, all also doing their jobs without really making any major mistakes, especially towards the back half of the game. As for BLG, couple of really good performances. Yagao in particular definitely stands out, having a really good game. You know, lane swapping into the top lane can always be a little bit risky for people who aren't as familiar with playing that side of the map, but Yagao played it really, really well, and that team fight, like I said in the mid lane, was incredibly crucial for BLG to be able to get that first Baron of the game, and a lot of that was Yagao just absolutely popping off. He was pretty fantastic, and unfortunately, the rest of the team really wasn't all that great towards the back half of the game. My dud of the game is going to go to on the Alistar, just a couple of times where he was a little bit too far forward, and, you know, he was probably the most noticeably out of position, but Elk in the later team fights was definitely a little bit too far forward without any sort of, like, mega peel on the team, especially with Alistar as his support. And then Bin had a good game. He just didn't necessarily matter all that much. He was able to create pressure inside lanes, but that pressure really wasn't translated into anything. And then June was fine on the Vi, was out of position a couple of times, but for the most part was just kind of meh. This really was kind of similar to game number 1, where it felt more just like a team diff, as opposed to any one player making any sort of major mistake for BLG. And that's where it has to start to get a little bit demoralizing on the side of BLG. What do you need to do to beat JDG? You were in a good position this game, but like I said, it only took one fight. Hopefully, you're now going into game number 3. Your series is on the line. You know, if you lose, you're not out of the tournament. You just go to lower bracket, which isn't the end of the world, but you probably want to at least take one against JDG. Winning the series is definitely going to be an uphill battle, but it's going to have to start in game number 3. And then for JDG, they probably want to get this one done and dusted. This is a very good team. They have already shown that they have resiliency. They've already shown that they have the ability to win in the early game. They just need to close out the series now, and I think a lot of people are going to have expectations of them doing so. So, is JDG going to be able to do it in a clean sweep in game number 3, or is BLG going to be able to fight back and bring us, at the very least, to a game number 4? Well, the winner of game number 3 was JD Gaming. They are able to take game number 3 in what was a crazy game. I mean, we talked about game 2 being relatively close. We talked about it being back and forth. It had nothing on game number 3 here, which was really, really wild. You can see the score lines kind of across the board for basically every single player in the game, mostly on JDG, mostly, you know, the mid and the bot laner for JDG, who both played absolutely out of their minds in this game number 3, but what a fun game, back and forth, a lot of action. So I don't want to waste too much time with the preamble in this one. I want to get right into the overview because there really is a lot to talk about in this 40-minute game for JDG and for BLG for that matter. The game is really active even in the early game. There really isn't a lot of wasted time from either of these teams. There is a first blood in the bot lane. It's just a 2v2 kill, but instead of like the first couple of games, this one's actually going in favor of BLG with Elkanon playing the level 1 or the level 3, I think in this case, really, really well, being able to generate that lead. And not really what I expected, especially in this matchup. Ruler has been spectacular on Zeri over the last year or so. In fact, there were a lot of people in my comment section back in 2022, you can go check my LCK videos, that were saying that Ruler was a Zeri one-trick and that he wasn't able to play anything else. Obviously, that was wrong. That's always been wrong. I pushed back on that last year a lot, and he has proven nothing but that being entirely wrong across this entire year. But this is a champion that is very dangerous in the hands of Ruler, and, you know, maybe it wasn't great in the early game. We'll get to the point where it was great, and you know what? We'll kind of just get there now, because it really was the mid game. And I know I didn't talk a lot about, you know, the early game, but there was action. You know, it's JDG catching a Gao in top river. It's, you know, both teams 4 or 3 manning bot lane to trade kills. It was a lot of back and forth. There really wasn't a lot of, you know, one team kind of getting ahead. I would say JDG definitely comes out of the early game a little bit stronger, but it's not, like, detrimental to either team. Both teams are in a relatively decent spot, I would say, after the early game, but JDG definitely start to pull away. Now, BLG's macro in the mid game was actually really good. This is something we saw really start to begin in the Cloud9 series in round number 1. They really out-macroed Cloud9 by a significant margin in that best of 5, but they really hadn't been that team, really up until that point, even at this tournament, but, you know, in the LPL, they certainly weren't the macro team. They were definitely more of the early game aggression, just try to outplay your opponent and get a lead kind of team. They definitely showed off that the macro that they increased going into this tournament definitely is true, because they had good macro here in the mid game, particularly taking Herald while also taking mid tower, and JDG really just not having an answer to it. But unfortunately, the mid game is where Ruler starts to get absolutely fed on this Zeri. The second dragon fight is really where things start to completely turn in favor of JDG. Ruler absolutely pops off. He starts to go completely insane in that fight, and he gets ridiculously far ahead. It's certainly not the only fight where he looks good in the mid game. There's a fight in bot jungle that at first looks like a really good catch from BLG. They set it up properly. They're able to get onto the backliners with the jacks. The Nidalee spears are hitting, but none of it matters because Ruler just outplays them. His spacing is absolutely perfect. He's able to deal a ridiculous amount of damage, and they're able to basically turn it into a 4-for-1. JDG just outplaying BLG. There really is no other way to put it. Ruler is so freaking good. He has been the best player on the Rift in all 3 games up until this point. And, you know, honestly, we'll get to it, but that could probably continue to be the case throughout the entire game if you really wanted to believe that. However, you know, JDG in this lead, they want to go for Baron. They want to be able to try and accelerate this. They want to be able to try and end the game, but, you know, bad spacing from JDG. The one bad team fight, honestly, that they had across this entire series was probably this first Baron fight where June's spears are landing. Kanavi is getting incredibly low inside the Baron pit. The Nidalee jumps in and is able to steal the Baron, which is massive for BLG, and then they're able to absolutely dominate the subsequent fight. And that's huge. BLG goes from basically 2K gold down to 3K gold up, like basically immediately just from that one singular fight. It's basically everything that they could have asked for. It's really, really well played by everyone involved, and that's massive. Unfortunately, they're just not able to do a whole lot with that Baron and with that gold lead. They do try and push a little bit, but they're really not able to gain anything. A very similar story to what we were talking about in game number 2. JDG doing a phenomenal job of realizing that they just have to shut the game down for 5 minutes, that they have to not let BLG use this Baron power play to their advantage. And you know what? Congratulations to JDG. They clearly knew how they had to handle that zone because they did it very well in both games 2 and 3. This is all leading into the second Baron. That's kind of what both teams really start to play towards, and BLG at first looked like they were in a really good position for this. They actually are in a much better position for this than what JDG are in, but this is where I just have to start, you know, fanboying out, whatever you want to say, like, completely losing my mind. Like, this is one of the best team fights I've ever seen on the side of JD Gaming, and you can credit everybody involved, but really the main centerpiece of this fight was Knight on this Syndra. We know that it's his best champion. We know he's the best Syndra in in the world. Nobody is really contesting that argument. There are a lot of good Syndras in the world, but Knight just plays this champion at a completely different level. We've known that for many, many, many years, and he got it in game number 3 here. And this fight, this singular fight, should give you a full example as to why this champion has to be permabanned against JD Gaming, because this was one of the best fights I've ever seen. It was perfect. It felt like 900 times BLG had an opportunity to get on Ruler, but then all of a sudden there was a scatter from Knight, or there was a perfect disengage from Missing, or 369 was going in on the Cassante, and it was just time after time after time giving Ruler the opportunity to carry this game. Knight must have hit like 7 Scatter the Weeks in a row, and they were somehow able to win this second Baron fight. They're able to get the Baron, and they're able to reassert their dominance in this game. They do not win this fight if they don't play 100% perfectly. Like, that's where BLG was at. It wasn't even that they played this all that bad. They were doing everything that they were supposed to do in this fight, but JD Gaming was just a little bit better. Unfortunately, JDG not able to end off of that Baron. It goes to a third Baron, which June is able to steal again. That's his second Baron steal of the game, but unfortunately, the result in the fight is not the same this time, with JDG being able to ace BLG and then being able to walk down mid and end the game. Crazy game from both of these teams. JDG playing out of their minds. I think a lot of people are going to give player of the game to Ruler for this one, and he's going to get my player of the series. Don't worry, he was the best player on this Rift in this series as a whole, but how can I not give player of the game to Knight? He was so crazy good in that one team fight. He was great throughout the whole game. Like, I don't want it to seem like he was just really good in that team fight. The dude was doing so much damage throughout this entire game on the Syndra, but that one fight was maybe the single most perfect team fight I've ever seen anyone play, and he's gonna get player of the game for that. Like, I'm not gonna apologize for that. He was phenomenal. We were all wondering if Knight was gonna be able to show up at MSI. He's had good performances at international tournaments in the past, but he's never really been that guy like he's been in the LPL. This was a that guy performance. This was a top 1 player in the world kind of performance from Knight in this game, and I'm finally able to say that he's going to get the credit that he deserves on an international stage. But Ruler was spectacular. Again, he's player of the series as a whole. Dude was phenomenal. They consistently, JDG that is, invested a lot into making sure that Ruler was going to be able to win them the game, and he repaid them tenfold every single time. That's what you want out of the best AD carries in the world. You want to be able to say, like, I trust you to be able to win the game, and for them to be able to go out and just win the game. That's what you want out of Ruler, and he was able to accomplish that goal. Everybody else was good too. 369 Kanavi Missing were all solid. Missing in particular had a really good series, but really the spotlight was definitely on Ruler and then Knight in game number 3. And then for BLG on the other side, it's just unfortunate you're not JDG. Like, that really is what it came down to across this series. It wasn't even that they played all that bad. There were mistakes for sure. Elk's gonna get my dud of the game in game number 3. I think his positioning was just a little bit poor over the course of this series, but that's kind of what you get with Elk. He's gonna be a little bit over-aggressive with his positioning. If the rest of the team is able to follow up, it's gonna look good. If the rest of the team isn't able to follow up, it's probably going to look bad like it did on Ultra Prime. It just kind of is the case with him as a player. I'm not going to completely abandon a lot of the confidence that I had in him as a player just because he hasn't been his best at this tournament, but he really has not been his best at this tournament, in my opinion. I thought Ben was okay on Jax. He was doing everything he was supposed to do. He was trying to get on the Zeri. Unfortunately, the peel on the side of JDG was just better than his engage, and that's really where it ends up being. June steals 2 Barons and loses the game. That's got to feel pretty bad. Yagao and On were just kind of there. They were good setup for the rest of the team, but they weren't going to change the fate of everything that was going on. You needed this Aphelios or this Jax to be able to pop off, and unfortunately it wasn't able to happen. And across this whole series, BLG honestly just felt outclassed. That's the best way I can put it. The sweep mostly is for the case that JDG is just the better team, and certainly the better team fighting team, which we kind of knew going into this series, but it certainly is a little bit frustrating to see. But overall, I would say it's a mess series for BLG. They definitely looked outclassed, but no major, like, overstanding errors, I guess. Like, overarching errors is the word I was looking for. Nothing that I would be worried about with them now moving into lower bracket. They have a chance to face G2. That's certainly going to be an intriguing matchup. We'll preview that at the end of the video, but for now, BLG is basically in the exact same position I thought they would be going into this part of the tournament, and JDG is somehow in an even better position. I still think this is probably the best team in the world right now. They're certainly going to have a chance to prove it, though, going on to face T1 in the upper bracket finals. That series is going to be an absolute blast, and whoever comes out of that series moving on to finals is going to have a ridiculous amount of confidence for the rest of this tournament. But that's going to bring us to our second series of the day, and this one a little bit more consequence, I would say. Not that obviously upper bracket isn't important. You want to be able to stay in upper bracket for as long as possible. You want to be able to continue to generate that momentum. But if you lose this upcoming series, you are officially eliminated from MSI. So the stakes are definitely high. And it's our final region war of the tournament as we have our LCS matchup between the number 1 seed from the LCS in Cloud9 and the number 2 seed from the LCS in Golden Guardians. Certainly an intriguing matchup, a rematch of LCS finals, which obviously went in the direction of Cloud9. They were definitely the better team across that entire series, and honestly, it really wasn't all that close between these two teams. Cloud9 was definitely better once they figured out, how Golden Guardians like to play. Golden Guardians very much need that early game lead. They want to be able to generate early leads and then, kind of transition that into aggressive play in the mid game. If they're not able to do that, a lot of the plays that they like to go for, a lot of the more aggressive invades, Stixxay's really aggressive positioning, it doesn't necessarily pay off nearly as well if they don't have the gold to back it up. And so Cloud9 definitely still going to know that going into this series, but Golden Guardians has actually been okay at this tournament. They haven't exactly been like world beaters, but they were able to make it out of the play-in stage, being the 3rd team to make it out of there, even after being on the same side of the bracket as BLG, which is really good. And honestly, I think you could make a case that they looked all right against JD Gaming. They didn't win a single game, but they weren't absolutely trounced in any of the games either. Same thing for Cloud9. They looked pretty solid in all the games against BLG, even though they weren't able to take any. And so I think for me, I think a lot of people are swaying in the direction of Golden Guardians. You hear a lot of co-streamers swaying in the direction of Golden Guardians. That, to me, is just too recency bias. As you know from my previous video, I'm still going for Cloud9 in 4. On this one, I definitely still think that they should be the better team. I don't think Golden Guardians matches up particularly well against them, and I think Berserker and Blabber are still the 2 best players in this series by a considerable margin. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. It's time to kick off the series, and of course, we got to kick it off starting with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was Cloud9. They are able to take the first game in this series, and honestly, it was relatively clean from them. This was a really, really good win, a 22-23, basically, minute win here from Cloud9. Basically, exactly what you wanted to see to start the series off. Golden Guardians, a very, very momentum-reliant team, as we talked about a lot with them, not only, in the playoffs, but throughout the entire year. They would go on losing streak and then winning streak and then losing streak. They very much relied on feeling themselves in the current moment to be able to win. So picking up a game 1 win against them is usually going to be a pretty good strategy to put them on the back foot early, and Cloud9 honestly just kind of played their game. This was a pretty standard win, not a lot of crazy shenanigans going on. They were just kind of the better team in this one. So let's go ahead and talk about what ended up happening. C9 definitely controlled the early game, even if they were making some mistakes, which we'll talk about. They were the ones at least making the plays. They were controlling the map. They were getting the objectives, and that's always going to be kind of the barometer for who's going to end up, kind of having the power going into the mid game, and that was definitely Cloud9. Eminus with a really nice roam bot lane, a really poor fight from Stixxay and Huhi early on in the game, and the isolated 2v2 gets them really low, and then all Eminus has to do is come down and kill them under tower to get a free double kill to start the game. That's pretty good to get on the Sylas. Always good to accelerate that champion early, especially against something like the Jace. If you can get gold on the Sylas early, he's going to be a lot more difficult to deal with, especially for a champion like Jace that doesn't really have a lot of tools, outside of laning phase to really, keep up with the Sylas. And so good stuff from Eminus, even if he does relatively underperform the rest of this game. Certainly he underperforms in a gank mid. Blabber looks like he has a free kill onto Gory, but Eminus just goes a little bit too early and ends up getting solo killed. Not exactly sure what ended up happening there, but eventually the subsequent fight ends up being a Golden Guardians win, which is really good. Blabber ends up going down in the exchange as well. Golden Guardians kind of keeping things relatively close. Unfortunately, those would be the only 2 kills that Golden Guardians would get the entirety of the rest of this game. Pretty much everything else was entirely in favor of Cloud9. Now, the mid game was incredibly slow. Not really a lot of action happening. Mostly both of these teams just saying like, okay, well, we want to scale up and we're going to have our big fight probably around the Baron. That's what both teams look like they want to set up for. Neither really wanting to make any sort of major decisions. There were a couple of picks in the side lane. The big one, in my opinion, being Stixxay and Huhi just being a little bit too far forward in the mid lane, trying to trade back once Cloud9 made a play bot. But outside of that, like, it's Cloud9 with a small, like, 1k gold lead. It's nothing massive. Both teams are absolutely still in the game by the time we hit the 20-minute mark. And that's where the Baron dance really starts. And This is where Cloud9 just absolutely outplays Golden Guardians. They're just better in this Baron fight by a large margin. It's basically perfectly played by Cloud9, very slow. They're able to maintain aggro on the Baron the entire time while also picking up 3 kills against Golden Guardians. It's about as clean of an execution as you could possibly ask for. They're able to get the Baron, they're able to get Golden Guardians in a bad position, and then from that point onwards, they're just able to exert a lot of their pressure. They send a lot of pressure top lane, but Licorice ends up getting caught in the mid lane by Fudge, who immediately teleports in and jumps right on top of Stixxay. He blows him up immediately. Huhi ends up dying. It ends up being, I believe, a 4 or a 5 for 0, and Cloud9 at 22 minutes is basically just able to run through the top lane, run into the base, and end the game with the Baron buff. It's really clean, really good stuff from Cloud9. Honestly, like, this was a good game. I'm really... I don't want to say encouraged by what I saw here, because Golden Guardians obviously isn't the toughest of competition in the world, but Cloud9 did everything that they were supposed to do, with the exception of that really bad trade in the mid lane early on in the game. There was basically no mistakes from them. They played slow, they played controlled, and they capitalized on all the advantages that the other team gave them. I would have liked to see them be a little bit more aggressive in the mid game, but at the end of the day, if you feel comfortable that you're going to be able to win that fight at Baron basically no matter what, go ahead and take it. Like, play for that. I understand that. My player of the game is going to go to Berserker. He just continues to be the best player on the Rift anytime that NA teams are involved, and I don't think that's really going to change all that much over the next couple of months. He's really, really good at Aphelios. He was just better than Stixxay throughout the entirety of this game. His gun management was really good. His positioning is fantastic. It's just a lot of positives. Eminus was good outside of that really bad mistake that he made in the mid lane. Blabber, I thought, was really underratedly good. Same thing for Fudge. I think both of them actually had really solid games, especially in the mid game, keeping Golden Guardians from really making any of the plays that they want to, and Sven was solid on the Lulu as well. Again, a team effort for Cloud9, not one individual player, but Berserker definitely being the standout member, I would say. For Golden Guardians on the other side, they're just not as good as Cloud9. That's really becoming apparent. I know a lot of people really like this team, but, you know, the talent is definitely going to catch up to them at some point, and it looks like it's happening here. Cloud9 very much has their number in terms of, you know, knowing how to play against them, and I think that definitely came to fruition here. Dud of the game was definitely between two members. I gave it to Gory in the mid lane on this Jace. I just don't think he was all that impactful. No damage, was consistently caught out in side lanes, was not necessarily adding any sort of pressure. He just didn't play the Jace at a high level, but I think you could very realistically give this to Stixxay as well on the Jinx, who just got outplayed by Berserker basically for the entirety of this game. Both of them played relatively poorly, but Licorice had a bad game on the Fiora. River, I don't even think I said his name once on the Maokai. And then Huki was whatever on the Nautilus, was trying to keep Stixxay safe, but was just way too far forward in a lot of circumstances. Golden Guardians are just looking like they're on the back foot. Now, obviously, they can bounce back from this, but they're probably going to have to do it in game number 2 at the very least here. Going down 0-2 is close to a death sentence in a best of 5, and especially against a team like Cloud9 that is as talented as they are, it's going to be very difficult to win 3 in a row against them. So is Golden Guardians going to be able to tie it up, or are Cloud9 going to be able to just completely take full control of this series? Well, we'll find out right now, because the winner of game number 2 was Cloud9. They are able to take game number 2. They're able to go up into the series 2-0 and really take full control of their North American counterparts in this series. And I gotta be honest, this is basically the exact opposite of what we were seeing out of Europe across across their series, I should say, yesterday, across their best of 5, where it was, yes, one team dominating, very similar here with Cloud9 just kind of being the better team against Golden Guardians, but that series was littered with major mistakes, with teams being way too aggro, with teams, making plays that they probably have no ability to do so, because neither really knew what to do after 15 minutes. This series is kind of the opposite. No one wants to do anything. Neither of these teams want to actually take any risks. Neither of them want to play the game at all, and so the game ends up going to 20 minutes, and then eventually one team either gets Baron or the game is over, right? Like, there isn't a lot of action going on. It's pretty boring to watch, if I'm being honest, but, Golden Guardians definitely kept up a little bit more in game number 2 than they did in game number 1. So what ended up happening, and how did Cloud9 end up walking out of game number 2 with a win? Well, Golden Guardians actually had a pretty huge lead for a majority of this game. I wouldn't say huge, but a pretty solid lead for a majority of this game. They had a good early game. They were winning most of their lanes. Licorice ends up getting first blood in the top lane, solo killing Fudge, which is massive for him. He actually had a really good game. Licorice is definitely the member of Golden Guardians that I would say probably played the best throughout this game, even though he was caught out a couple of times. But for the most part, I would say that he was pretty consistent. He ended up getting first blood in that solo on the top side, but After that, we're just looking at objectives. We're looking at dragons, we're looking at heralds, and we're just looking at nothing else. No kills, no plays, no ganks, no nothing, basically, over the course of the entire early to mid-game. It really was slow and boring. There really is no other way to put it. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This was not a super fun game to end up watching, but we end up getting to 17 minutes, and GG win a big fight around 17 minutes. Honestly, everybody in that fight plays well, but it's Licorice and Stixxay in particular that are really carrying the load in terms of damage. Really impressive stuff, the two players that I think have been the most impressive across MSI so far. River and Gory have been good. Huhi is a player that I'm obviously very partial towards, but Licorice and Stixxay have definitely been the two that have re-emerged for Golden Guardians and kind of allowed them to get to this point in the first place. And so Golden Guardians honestly looking pretty good up until 20 minutes, but then Baron happens, and I can't even begin to explain why this happens almost every single time to a team like Golden Guardians, but you know, Cloud9 end up starting the Baron because they're behind, but they're not like crazy behind. It's like 3k gold. It's definitely a deficit, but it's not something that's completely insurmountable in a fight if you really need to. They just kind of lost lane, right? But Cloud9 definitely feel like they need to start pressuring somewhere, so they go for the Baron. They end up finding a nice catch onto Gory right before the fight starts, and so it's a 4v5, and Golden Guardians are just like, well, we can't get in, you know, I guess they get Baron, and then Cloud9 got Baron, and it's like, okay, well, that entire 3k lead that you just had is now gone, because Cloud9 with Baron is going to be incredibly lethal, and guess what? They were incredibly lethal once they got that Baron. I don't even really know how we ended up getting here, but just incredibly disrespectful from Cloud9, and incredibly, you know, too passive from Golden Guardians. Like, I can't begin to explain why they would make this decision, why they wouldn't at least attempt to try and steal at the very least. It didn't seem like Cloud9 was all that, you know, interested in trying to keep them out of the pit. It was such a weird play. I couldn't even begin to understand what was going through the mind of Golden Guardians. Just way too passive. Cloud9 takes that Baron and ends up running the rest of the game with it. They get a couple of fights in the mid lane that ends up, I think both of them were 2 for 0s, and, you know, that's good for Cloud9, but eventually, Golden Guardians, I think, just assume they still have the gold lead in this game for some reason, and they run it down mid lane. They go for mid-tier 2 as a group of 5, but that's just way too aggro. Yes, they get the tower, but they all die for it, and then Cloud9 just march mid lane, and they're able to end the game. This was so weird. This was not a good game from either of these two teams, and, you know, I guess you could give some credit to Cloud9. They were certainly the better of these two teams by a considerable margin. My player of the game is going to go to Fudge because I thought his team fighting was actually really good on the Gragas. He's been pretty solid over the course of this series so far, but he's someone who I was concerned about going into it because, honestly, he hasn't been playing well at MSI up until this point. It really has been the Blabber and Berserker show with Fudge and Eminus kind of not really being all that good. Luckily for Cloud9, I think top, mid, and jungle were all really big positives for them. I'm not going to say that top gap, right? That, you know, Licorice had a good game, and I'm not trying to disparage him, but it was definitely a mid-jungle gap in this game because Blabber and Eminus were definitely the two better players in their roles towards the back half of the game. Blabber was just more aggro. He was actively looking for plays. He was actively trying to gain advantages, whereas River, when he did have the lead, was just kind of sitting on it, waiting for the game to get to the point where the Kazakhs could actually fight back, which is not what you want to do as Viego, surprisingly enough. And then the mid lane was a massive gap. Gory had another really bad game here. He's going to get my dud of the game for Golden Guardians. Just has not been good across the first couple games of the series. Even if Eminus wasn't particularly fantastic, although that flash ultimate on the Stixxay at the end of the game was, like, hilarious, because what do you do as a Aphelios in that particular situation? It was still better than whatever Gory was offering, which was just a negative for the team overall. If you want to look for positives on the side of Golden Guardians, Stixxay and Huhi outplayed Berserker and Sven for the first part of this game. They won lane. They were just honestly better, and that should not happen as Aphelios Lulu into Zyrakan. So good stuff from Stixxay and Huhi. Unfortunately, the rest of the team just didn't want to peel for the Aphelios, though, and so he never really got to deal all the damage that he earned early on in the game. But overall, this is just not a good look for Golden Guardians. They're now down 0-2. There's really not a lot of opportunities for them to get back into the series. Obviously, it's got to start with game number 3. If you don't win game 3, you're doomed. You know, you're out of the tournament, but you would want to be able to win at least one game probably against your regional counterpart. But for Cloud9, you know, you're looking okay. I'm certainly not entirely concerned with them. You're at the very least taking advantage of what Golden Guardians is giving you, which I think is a good thing, but, you know, I would want to see them be a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more clinical. I know they're more of a late game team, especially with how they like to play against these more aggressive early game teams, but I don't want to see another game that is just super boring and passive up until 17 minutes. It's not really what I'm looking for, and Cloud9 has enough talent to be able to make that work. If they can start winning laning phases more consistently, I'm going to feel a lot more confident in this team. But is that going to happen in game number 3, or is Golden Guardians going to be able to keep this series alive? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Golden Guardians, they are able to take game number 3. They're able to keep this series alive at 2-1, even if it isn't the cleanest game of all time, which it absolutely wasn't. This wasn't some Golden Guardians game where they were just outplaying the enemy team from every moment in the game. This was a pretty traditional Golden Guardians win in comparison to what they were able to do in the LCS a lot of times. They were able to generate a really large early game lead. They were able to establish a lot of pressure, and from that point onwards, they were just able to outgold their opponent into the end game. Some nice plays by this team towards the back half, but really there were definitely some fights that were very questionable from them, but you certainly can't say that about all the players on this team. There were a couple that absolutely stepped up, and we will get to that when we get to that. But for Cloud9, definitely not what you were looking for, but if you were ever going to lose a game, game number 3 is probably it when you're up 2-0. So not the worst thing in the entire world, but let's get into how Golden Guardians ended up with this game 3 win. They, like I said, had a really good early game in this one. I think that's going to be the most encouraging sign of them all, if we're being entirely honest, because this team really hasn't been all that amazing in the early game across this series up until this point. Cloud9 has honestly just been a little bit better than them at their stage of the game, and that was kind of the case in LCS Finals as well. Like I said, it really did feel like Cloud9 kind of had Golden Guardians figured out in terms of if we shut them down in the early game, there's not a lot we can do, or they can do, I should say, and Golden Guardians definitely, you know, kind of took that to heart and said, well, screw it, we're just going to dominate the early game. Ganks left and right from River. I mean, the dude was just everywhere on the map pre-10 minutes. He was destroying every single lane. MSI was ganked for first blood in the mid lane, and then Sven ends up dying to a gank in the bot lane, and then Fudge ends up getting ganked top. It's every single lane getting impacted by this Kha'Zix, and this is exactly what I wanted to see. Kha'Zix, honestly, has been a surprisingly effective pick at this tournament. Obviously, we know he's incredibly strong in solo queue, but I expected him to be a more niche pick at the pro level, because it really does feel like you need the rest of the team kind of enabling him in order for him to be as strong as he possibly could be. But we're seeing a lot of these pros be able to not only pull him out, but be super active in the early game with him, and I think that was always going to be the question mark for me, to see him really be able to succeed on a lot of these ganks. Obviously, big credit to the junglers, both Blabber in game number 2 and River here in game number 3 for being able to pull him off so well, but it's just kind of surprising to see him have as much pressure as he did. But Golden Guardians is definitely able to generate a big lead off of River's pressure in the early game. C9 do stay in the game, though. They are able to fight relatively well. A pretty crucial fight for Herald pretty early on in this game that, honestly, Golden Guardians should not be giving over. Yes, there were definitely some trades in this instance. Cloud9 is able to get Herald, and they do end up dropping it top to get tier 2, but not only do they end up getting caught out, staying a little bit too long in the top lane, but Fudge actually just dies mid lane because he's trying to protect the mid tier 1 that ends up going down to Golden Guardians anyways. So not exactly the best macro of all time here, but at the very least, Cloud9 is trading something back, staying on the map, staying aggressive, and trying to get gold in some places, and this was a relatively interesting spot. Really, the play that a lot of people are going to remember from the mid game here is MSI's wild outplay of Gory in a bot lane fight. Just incredibly well played from him. He didn't have a perfect game here, but neither did Gory, who was honestly by far the weakest member of Golden Guardians in this game. MSI able to basically completely outplay him in this particular instance. On the Ahri, he's able to dodge basically everything on the Talia, and he's able to solo kill him. It was incredibly impressive stuff, not only for him to be able to get that solo kill but also for him to be able to get out. Just good stuff overall. Golden Guardians do look a lot better in the mid to late game, like the latter half of the mid game, I should say, with them being able to get Baron and then having a pretty nice fight in the bot lane, but unfortunately, Berserker just kind of outplays them. And there's this massive fight in the bot jungle where it looks fantastic for a catch for Golden Guardians. It looks like they're getting everything they want. They might even be able to end the game off of this, but Berserker just outplays everybody so hard. He spaces Stixxay perfectly. He's able to space Huki perfectly, although he does go down to Licorice, and obviously you can't dodge a point-and-click ability, but Berserker played out of his mind to be able to keep the game alive for Cloud9, and that ends up stopping push 1, and then we get push 2 with the second Baron, which also goes the way of Golden Guardians. This time they have to go in the pit and steal it. They're able to not only pick up the Baron, I should say, with River smiting it, but they're also able to win the subsequent fight. But when they go to push it down mid, they're just not able to win hard enough in the mid lane to be able to end the game. They end up getting pushed away, but eventually Berserker's just a little bit too far forward. Licorice is on the flank after pushing out bot lane, and he's able to catch him out. Once Jinx is dead, Cloud9 really has no other ways to win the team fight, and Golden Guardians are able to win the fight, push it down mid, and actually end the game to keep their MSI alive. It was a good showing showing overall from them. Certainly not perfect, but player of the game is pretty easily going to go to Licorice. He has not only been the best player in this game, he was not only the best player in this series, he has been the best player for Golden Guardians across this entire tournament. He's been pretty fantastic, and honestly, it wasn't what I really expected. He's been on such an upward trajectory over the course of 2023, and it's basically all you could ask for from him. He really didn't start off the year very hot, and honestly, he was really bad towards the back half of 2022. This is a player that I was vouching for a lot in the beginning half of last year, but now kind of the tables had turned. I wasn't nearly as excited about his gameplay this year as I was about what he was able to do, you know, a couple of years ago. But honestly, every single game, it feels like he gets more consistent and more solid. Maybe playing against a lot of the top-tier top laners and plans will do that. You know, he had a good series against Bin, which was really solid. But, you know, even against 369, he was holding his own. And he's been much better than Fudge across this entire series. And so, Licorice definitely deserving player of the game for game number 3. A couple of really fantastic team fights from him. His only kill being one of his more crucial ones, getting a shutdown on Berserker. And then outside of that, basically just playing perfect to make sure that Blabber doesn't really have a lot of opportunities to be able to engage, while also making sure that his backline stays relatively safe. River obviously had a great early game on the Kha'Zix. He really set everything in motion for Golden Guardians to stay in this game, and then the second Baron steal was absolutely massive for this team. Stixxay and Huki had some good team fights, even if they also had some bad team fights, if we're being entirely honest, and then Gory, honestly, has just been outplayed this entire series, but he was on the team that won, so we're not going to talk about him too much. As for Cloud9 on the other side, just a couple of players getting a little bit outplayed here. Dud of the game is going to go to Fudge in the top lane. He was pretty good in game number 2. And honestly, I think his struggles in this particular series are going to get a little bit overblown, I think, by a lot of analysts. But he's still not exactly the Fudge that I think we were all hoping we were going to see going into this tournament. We wanted to see him really dominate Golden Guardians and Licorice in particular, and it really hasn't been that. This was Licorice's game. He was a lot better, and Fudge really couldn't keep up, just dying and being out of position in places where he really had no right to be. Blabber was also just kind of getting outsmited. Wasn't entirely his fault. Playing Vi into Poppy can be relatively difficult to do in a lot of different circumstances, and so I'm not going to blame him entirely for this, but certainly wasn't the best game of all time. Eminence with that awesome solo kill didn't really do much else outside of that. And Berserker honestly tried to save the game on multiple occasions, but that final, you know, pushing way too far forward to contest that mid push was just disastrous. A really horrible decision with no backup, and it ends up losing the game for Cloud9. There's still a lot to like about C9. They only lost one game. They can absolutely still bounce back, I should say, here in game number 4 to be able to close out the series. But congratulations to Golden Guardians for at least showing that they're not complete pushovers and not getting swept in this series. Can they bring us to a game number 5? That's going to be the question. They do have the momentum after a really solid game number 4 here. They weren't exactly the best, most clinical team fighting team, but they've got a lot of positives. And if they can get another good early game like they did in this one, honestly, anything can happen. Is Cloud9 going to be able to shut them down, or is GG going to continue this miracle comeback? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Cloud9. They are able to take game number 4. They're able to close out this series in 4 games, and they're moving on to round number 2 in the lower bracket. It's kind of what we all wanted to see. We wanted to see C9 be able to walk out of the series. Maybe not all of us, right? A lot of us did want Golden Guardians to be able to pull off the miracle, but I think Golden Guardians maybe stands a little bit worse of a chance against some of the teams in the next round. I'll kind of explain why once we get to the end of the video, because I know some people might disagree with that because Golden Guardians are kooky and crazy. But remember, we're going into Gen G, not exactly the team that's going to be the most forgiving of late game mistakes, and that's quite frankly what Golden Guardians has a lot of. So Cloud9 being able to win this, definitely expected and definitely, I think, not particularly surprising, at least to me. But how did they play this game number 4? Well, they played it okay. Half of the game was really, really good from them. The other half, not so much. We'll go ahead and get into it. The half that I really liked was the early game. I thought they did a lot in the early game to be able to do, you know, to be able to generate, I should say, a pretty big lead and, you know, really put themselves in a good position to just kind of run the rest of the game, and that's kind of exactly what happened. They were able to generate this massive lead early, mostly just through outplays. First blood ends up going mid lane. You know, Gory gets super low from a pretty bad trade with Eminence and a nice gank from Blabber. He ends up having to burn his flash in that exchange, and so Blabber just says, well, what if I stick around? River, you know, correctly recognizes that this is probably going to be the play from the side of C9, and he waits there to try and dissuade the play, but the problem is they don't win 2v2, so River ends up getting poked out, Gory ends up getting dove under his tower mid, and mid lane's over. Like, the Cassante is just never going to be able to be stopped at this point, and that's pretty disastrous on the side of Golden Guardians. Really not a lot of things that the Yasuo can do at that point, and then a pretty big fight bot lane. This is where things really get to crack open. Blabber plays this bot dive absolutely perfectly. He's able to pick up 2 before he goes down in the Berserker. Berserker is able to get a third. It's a 3-for-1 at like 7 minutes into the game in favor of Cloud9. That's almost always going to be a game-defining moment, and it absolutely was here. Cloud9 really does generate like a 4 or 5k gold lead early on in this game, and it looks almost unlosable, for being entirely honest, for them, but they don't sit on their heels. They definitely still start to take some risky trades, some risky, fights in the mid game. Their gold lead is enough to make a lot of these fights worthwhile, but there's a fight in the bot lane that doesn't necessarily go their way. They are able to get Dragon, but not really able to do a ton outside of that. And then a fight in the mid lane that honestly looks like Golden Guardians should absolutely win it, but the pockets and the wallets of C9 are just much too big at this point for them to be able to outfight and outplay them. And so, unfortunately, Cloud9's lead just continues to grow, even if they aren't playing absolutely perfect. But this is where, honestly, things start to fall off the rails for Cloud9 and for Golden Guardians, basically equally. Neither team really playing all that well towards the back half of this game. Golden Guardians end up stealing Baron 4v5, which just should never happen in any circumstance. He's just allowed to, River that is just allowed to flash over the wall and smite, which I don't really know how we ended up getting there. Unfortunately, they aren't able to do anything with it, and they basically just allow Cloud9 to get Soul for free, and it's Chem Soul this game, which I do think is relatively good. I think a lot of other people disagree with that. I don't. I think Chem Soul is still relatively good. And then, we go to second Baron, which C9 do end up getting, but it's kind of flipped this time because C9 end up getting the Baron, but Golden Guardians outfights them just after, and so they're really not able to do anything with the Baron buff at this point. It's just misplay after misplay, neither team really being able to generate a strong lead. Eventually, C9 ends up getting the Elder Dragon. They end up being able to dominate the subsequent fight, and the game is ended off of that, but really not the cleanest performance from either team in this one. I liked Cloud9 a lot earlier in this series. Game number 1 in particular was really clean from them. I think game number 2 also had a lot of positives. They just kind of outplayed Golden Guardians. They showed kind of their player gap, but games 3 and 4 were not the most encouraging, I will say, moving on to the next round. My player of the game, though, in game number 4 is going to be Blabber. If there was one player who I think did play well across the entirety of this game, it was probably Blabber in the jungle. He continued to play really aggressive on the Nidalee, not only in the early game, but in the late game as well. He wasn't afraid to try and take trades, which I think is always going to be a positive for a winning jungler. And, just in general, I think Blabber gets a lot more hate than he gets credit. So I'm going to try to prop him up a bit more. He was really good in this game. Berserker and Sven were also great. Sven almost got player of the game for me on this Heimerdinger. I mean, this pick was absolutely devastating for Golden Guardians. They really had no way of dealing with it. River ends up getting solo killed at one point, invading the enemy jungle by Sven, which is absolutely disgusting, but it's really funny to watch. Overall, Blabber and Sven were probably the two best performers. Berserker had a really good scoreline. Eminus, I thought, also, had a lot of good engages. He just wasn't necessarily all that impactful, I would say, in terms of anything else. And then, honestly, Fudge probably had the least memorable game of anybody on Cloud9, but he didn't really make any major mistakes in comparison to what he was doing in game number 3. But for Golden Guardians on the other side, it's an unfortunate way for them to end their tournament, but at the very least, they were able to get a win in the main bracket stage here, which is more than Mad Lions can say, I guess. My dead of the game is going to go to Gory. He was just completely outclassed in this series. This was miserable from Gory, which is not the player I expected to really not be performing all that well. He was far from the only one. I think Licorice obviously had a good series, and River certainly had a good couple of games, but the bot side of this map was not particularly strong. 6A and Huki continuously giving over a lot of advantages to Berserker and Sven, and then Gory really just not even being able to keep up with Eminus at all, and honestly being a target for Cloud9 in terms of a lot of the pressure they wanted to show. It was a good showing at this tournament, especially compared to the expectations that they were offered, but overall, Golden Guardians just wasn't good enough to be able to advance past the bracket stage. But, in the grand scheme of things, them being able to play as well as they did in play-ins, I think, is generally just a success in its own right? Like, them being able to dominate a lot of these teams that I think a lot of people thought were going to be close to them. PSG Talon and GAM. These are teams that I think, people expected them to not be as good as, those two teams. And so for Golden Guardians to be able to not only beat both of them, but make it out of the bracket, be able to take a game off of BLG, not look horrendous against a team like JDG, and still end up taking a game against Cloud9, I think they're going to consider this run at MSI a success, even if they weren't able to get out of any of the series in the main stage. But for Cloud9, on the other hand, they now move on to face Gen G. Certainly not an easier challenge coming up ahead for this Cloud9 team. Their macro has certainly suffered. Their late game was certainly not as good as it needed to be in this series, especially towards the back half, and that's certainly something that is going to need to be worked out going into that Gen G matchup. But at the very least, we have a North American team moving on, and I think if any of them make me feel at least a little bit of confidence that maybe they take a game, I think with the personal performances and just the skill that this team has, Cloud9 is probably the one I want moving forward. Alright, but that is going to do it for my MSI Day 6 overview and analysis video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below. Of course, tomorrow, we've got BLG versus G2. That's certainly an intriguing matchup. BLG obviously losing to JDG in the upper round 2. G2 getting through after obviously getting trounced by Gen G in round 1, but being able to, quite frankly, destroy Mad Lions in a very sloppy series from both teams. I'm still definitely going to have to go BLG favored on this one, I think, especially with the form that G2 were in coming out of that series with Mad. I don't have a lot of confidence about any team coming out of the West right now because I just don't think any of them have looked particularly good at this tournament. This should be a BLG 3-0, but honestly, I'm going to predict it to be BLG 3-1. BLG is one of those teams that is just kind of bound to throw a game every once in a while, and G2's good enough to be able to steal one, but with the form that G2's in, I really would not be surprised if this was a 3-0, but let me know what you guys think of BLG G2 down in the comment section as well. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit that like button. It really does mean a lot for the channel. Not only does it let me know that you guys are enjoying the content, but it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always appreciative of. And of course, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be posting about every single day of MSI action, just like in this video. So if you did enjoy what you saw in this one, I really recommend hitting that subscribe button and hitting that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. Of course, up in the iCard is still going to be linked the full playlist of every single game at MSI, so you can check that out. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.